Welcome back, everyone. In the second video, we saw how Charlemagne's political authority, the political authority of the Carolingians, brings together the papal leadership component of medieval civilization, medieval European civilization, and the Frankish ruler component of medieval civilization. Then in the last video, we saw how, and I'll just move the slideshow on here, we saw how Charlemagne's commitment to encouraging learning in his kingdom as necessary for the proper practice of Christianity brought together the components of monasticism and Frankish political power, or Frankish rulers. And I explained how this desire for learning, this recognition of learning as a necessity for practicing religion, spilled over from purely religious learning to learning about literature, learning about mathematics, learning about science. And this provided the foundation for a medieval culture of learning that would survive the Carolingians and would provide the foundation for independent secular learning that in turn will provide the foundation for the spread of European knowledge and European approaches to education throughout the world. In contrast with the limitations of the intellectual culture of the Islamic civilization, for example, where there's a ceiling where further learning seems to be a rejection of revelation. We don't find that in the Carolingian culture of learning. And this means that even though Carolingian learning at this point is significantly inferior to what we find in the Islamic societies in Africa and the Middle East and in Spain at this time, the foundations of Carolingian learning are much more securely built for an ongoing development of learning throughout the medieval European world. Despite these successes, the Carolingian Empire is going to decline and fall beginning in the 9th century. It will come face to face with a number of challenges. However, its importance is not that it survives, because it doesn't, but that it provides a conceptual framework for modern Europe and more immediately for medieval Europe. The idea that you can unite Frankish leadership, papal authority, and the intellectual and social achievements and contributions of monasticism together into a single society that forms a medieval European civilization. Now, despite the fact that Charlemagne was an emperor, he was still a Frank, and he maintained many Frankish customs. He and his father had both benefited from the fact that his brother and his uncle had either died or had joined monastic foundations. But the custom was still to divide Frankish inheritance, and as far as we can gather, Charlemagne planned to do this as well. However, the Carolingians again get lucky because by the time Charlemagne dies in 814, he had only one surviving son Louis, and Louis will become an important French royal name. Louis is known as Louis the Pious. He certainly continued and expanded Charlemagne's program of learning and education. He expanded Charlemagne's practice of founding monasteries that would produce texts and encourage the growth of literacy. But this epithet, Louis the Pious, is not necessarily only a compliment. It's also partly an expression of political weakness. Louis has to deal with a number of rebellions early in his reign. In 822, he has to squash a rebellion by his cousin Bernard. His own cousin rebels against him. Now that the great Emperor Charlemagne has died after this 40-year reign, the different power figures, the different margraves and counts in the empire are kind of testing the boundaries of their restrictions. And so Bernard rebels against Louis the Pious, but he's defeated. And Bernard had already rebelled against Louis before. And so this time Louis said, and Louis had forgiven him. This time Louis says, this time you have to be punished, even if only as an example, to show that people can't commit treachery against the emperor. So he had Bernard blinded. But the blinding goes wrong and Bernard dies. And Louis is consumed by grief and remorse that Bernard has died. He feels as though he's done something wrong, and he does penance. He does public penance for taking a life. And this seems pretty admirable, pretty humble. You can see how the society has changed. Clovis wasn't doing penance for taking anyone's life who had crossed him in this way. Remember the story of the warrior whose head he splits with the axe for breaking Clovis's vase. So you can see how there's a growing sense of perhaps a rule of law, that it's not just the power of the king, but that a ruler can do something wrong here. However, in the immediate fact, it makes Louis look weak. It suggests that he's embarrassed by taking action against those who have rebelled against him. And so it sort of justifies or emboldens people who might resist some of Louis's decisions. And we see this in the relationship that Louis has with his sons. Louis has a difficult task enough trying to keep this empire together. And this task is made still more difficult by the fact that he has 3 sons who survive. Unluckily for him, unlucky for the Carolingian dynasty and the empire, this consistent fortune of 3 previous generations of only having one heir, one very obvious heir, it ends with Louis the Pious. He has 3 mature sons, and they're all competing, and the inheritance is going to be divided between them because that's what Franks do. And so Louis tries to prevent his sons from competing with one another after he dies. He tries to prevent an outbreak of civil war. And so he designates his oldest son Lothar as the imperial successor. He says, you're going to receive most of the empire. You're going to be the emperor. I'm going to give something minor to your brothers Louis and Pepin. And so you can see the portable inheritance, this practice of dividing the kingdom, is changing a little bit. There's an idea that the oldest son should receive significantly more than his brothers in order to maintain stability. However, in 823, Louis's second wife gives birth to another son named Charles the Bald. And Charles the Bald, he was bald when he was a baby, and the later Carolingians get these kind of unflattering epithets. But Charles the Bald was the son of Louis the Pious's old age. He was his baby, he was the child that Louis really doted upon. And so Louis remakes his will to include Charles at the expense of the 3 older sons. And this is really problematic because it shows that these wills can be changed. It teaches the other sons that perhaps if they push hard enough, they can kind of get a better inheritance, they can get a better deal. And so over the next 10 years, you have a bewildering succession of civil wars between Louis and different combinations of his son. Sometimes it's 2 sons against Louis and the other son and Charles the Bald. Sometimes it's 3 sons against 1. At one point, they even force Louis the Pious to abdicate and join a monastery, although then they have another fallout and they bring him back. These conflicts are obviously bad for the image and the ability of the empire to govern and maintain stability. If what it means to replace the Roman Empire and to be successful is to provide that sort of stability, the Carolingians are increasingly struggling to do that. In 840, Louis dies. Pepin had also died by this point, but the civil war continues with the other 3, Charles the Bald, Louis, known as Louis the German, and Lothar. Eventually, Charles and Louis unite together to defeat Lothar at the bloody Battle of Fontenoy. And this battle ends the Carolingian civil wars for the moment and leads to the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This is the last key term of this week. The Treaty of Verdun divides Charlemagne's empire into 3. Lothar, who was the oldest son but he'd been defeated, he receives the Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom of modern-day Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, Italy, and Burgundy. And this kingdom will break apart very quickly. It will break apart quickly because Lothar has 3 sons. He divides the inheritance again. And also there are all kinds of mountains and rivers that are in the way that make it very difficult geographically, for geographic reasons as well as political reasons, to unite these territories. At the same time, the rulers of Italy, the Carolingian rulers of Italy, will have to counter Abbasid attacks on Italy. We focus mostly on the Abbasids as promoters of learning and education, but they certainly weren't adverse to trying to expand their empire through military means as well. And so Italy, in the Middle Kingdom, becomes the focus of these attacks, at the same time as after each generation the kingdom is further divided and weaker. And so we have even an ambassador sack of the city of Rome itself in 846. And while we don't see further Islamic invasions of Sicily, we find that there is Muslim rulers in Sicily and that they're increasingly established in southern Italy. So Charlemagne's reign has shown that it's possible to implement a three-tiered medieval model that could replace Rome: Frankish kings, monks, papal leadership. But the way that the Middle Kingdom just falls apart in about 3 generations after Charlemagne shows that this medieval solution, medieval succession to the fall of Rome is pretty fragile at this time. It's certainly unstable. Louis the German, the second son, receives what's called the Eastern Kingdom. This kingdom is much of Western modern-day Germany. Now, the weakness of the Carolingian rulers again becomes obvious within a few generations. It becomes obvious because they struggle to defend this kingdom, this Eastern Kingdom, against a new group of invaders from Eastern Europe. A new group of invaders from Eastern Europe and the Russian steppe known as the Magyars. And the Magyars become terrifying, basically a terrifying raiding power in the Eastern Kingdom. And what have been the great power of the Carolingians? If you go back to Charles Martel, they can defend you against invaders. And the Carolingian rulers of the Eastern Kingdom, it soon becomes clear, aren't powerful enough to do that, aren't competent enough to do that. So you have political weakness there. Nevertheless, this kingdom remains intact. It remains a single kingdom. So we'll come back to that more later on. Charles the Bald receives the Western Kingdom. This quickly breaks down among competing Carolingian factions and Viking raids that we'll discuss next time. So you have another raiding group here. The raiding group in the east is the Magyars. The raiding group in the west is the Vikings. At the same time, different Carolingian nobles in the Western Kingdom are fighting with one another and are competing with one another, and the Charles the Bald and his successors struggle to establish any kind of centralized authority. And so the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne does not survive. It breaks down under a combination of outside raiders, Muslims to the south, Magyars to the east, Vikings to the west, and the self-destructive Frankish practice of partible inheritance. At the same time, it is immensely important to the history of the Middle Ages, of Europe, and of Western civilization because it provides a conceptual framework for a European civilization following the fall of the Roman Empire. First, it shows that these building blocks that we'd seen a little bit under Clovis and the barbarian kingdoms, it shows it is possible to combine them together. And that when you do, it can produce a stable kingdom that provides peace and supports learning and education. Second, the Treaty of Verdun, this key word, last key word of the week, is significant because it establishes the patterns and framework for much of the rest of European political history. The Eastern Kingdom will become Germany, the Western Kingdom will become France, and they will compete over the Middle Kingdom, which will fragment. In fact, what's really interesting is you can already see this division in the signing of the Treaty of Verdun, because the Treaty of Verdun was written out in 2 languages that were now associated with the Eastern and Western Empire. So we've moved on from Latin, we've moved on perhaps from just a smorgasbord of barbarian languages, but there are 2, not 1, but 2 vernaculars for the Frankish Empire. An Eastern vernacular that will become German, a Western vernacular that will become French. So in this way, although the Carolingian Empire does not endure, framework, ideas, memory of the Carolingians will form the basis for both medieval and modern Europe, a foundation that will last for 1,000 years. I hope you've enjoyed this information for week 7, and I'll see you again in week 8.